everyone. Welcome back to the final session of day one of the Aquatic Life Conference. I'm Sofika Kosnuk, the Managing Director at Aquatic Life Institute, and thrilled to be joining you for this last session of the day. And today's session is called Fish Intelligence, Sentience, Emotions, and Welfare. And this particular issue, I think, is exactly where people begin on their journey of understanding what is happening in the aquatic animal welfare space. I have many questions for Dr. Culum coming up, but we'll obviously open it up to all of our participants as well. So please get ready for a very fascinating session. Just a few reminders before we get started. The audience is muted upon entry and your cameras are off. If you have any questions, please take advantage of the question and answer box, and that'll pop up in the chat. We'll answer the questions, or as many of them as possible, at the end of the session. This session, along with all others, is being recorded and will be distributed following the conference. Please stay tuned for that. And it is also being streamed live on Facebook. We do expect a respectful and productive discussion and do have a zero tolerance policy for any type of harassment or discrimination. This final session of the day is 50 minutes long. We have approximately 30 minutes set aside for our wonderful presenter. And then we'll have around 20 minutes for the question and answer period. So, as a very brief introduction to his long and very accomplished resume, Dr. Culum Brown is a professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He is a behavioral ecologist with a special interest in fish cognition and welfare. And he has a staggering number of publications, scientific publications that are peer-reviewed, over 120 on this particular issue alone, as well as being a published author on this issue. So I think that we can absolutely call him a bona fide expert. And again, we are thrilled to have you in this space with us today. Welcome, Culum.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see everybody virtually from the other side of the world. The sun's just come up over here, so we're a bit crusty this morning, but I think we'll be fine. I'll go ahead and share my screen, shall I? There we go. Everybody see that well? All right. So thanks for having me. I guess I came to this topic indirectly because I've been working with fishes and looking at fish cognition for a really long time. And it eventually occurred to me that a lot of what I was doing had direct relevance to, I guess, fish welfare more broadly, because I spent a lot of time looking after fish. So this talk is going to be about pain, emotions, and the implications for fish welfare. Always does this. Keyboard always freezes because it won't operate while I'm talking on Zoom at the same time. So why should we care about fishes? Well, hopefully you guys will have a pretty good idea about that already. But fundamentally, we interact with fishes in so many different ways. Commercial fisheries is obviously a huge thing around the world, but unfortunately we've overfished the world's fish stocks. So aquaculture is rapidly taking its place. Of course, aquaculture is one of the fastest growing industries in the world currently, and it will soon be responsible for the majority of the protein that humans eat. Recreational fishing is also a huge pastime across North America, Europe, and Australia. And people may be surprised to discover that actually after cats and dogs, fish are the most popular pet in the world, but numerically they're the most common. So there's more pet fish than any other animal. And of course, for scientists, fish are rapidly becoming the go-to animal for just about any kind of experimentation, but increasingly in medical sciences, things like zebrafish are replacing rats and mice. So there's a good number of fish that are used every year for scientific research. And of course, if you're interested in conservation and biodiversity, there are more species of fish than all the other vertebrates combined. So there's lots of good reasons why we should be interested in fish. And of course, the manner in which we interact with fish has lots and lots of implications in terms of ethics and welfare. I thought I should start by moving my slides by introducing what I think of when I say sentience. And sentience to me is just the capacity to feel anything really, whether it be neutral or valence, that is positive or negative feelings. And that includes emotions, obviously. And increasingly, there's a move around the world to recognize that animals are sentient beings. You can see, the Treaty of Lisbon, 2008, when the EU started to recognize sentience in animals. It also happened in New Zealand fairly recently, 2015, and in 2019, the Australian Capital Territory also recommended that we recognise sentience in animals as well. So it's becoming a pretty widespread phenomena, and in all of those cases, fish are included in those definitions. That's often the key, recognising that fish are included in the definition of animal in most of those legislations. I think it would be fairly safe to say that fish have a pretty bad press when it comes to people's expectations of their learning and memory capacity. So their cognitive ability is grossly underestimated. And there's lots and lots of examples of this in a popular press. This is an example of an advertisement on TV over here in Australia where this fish swims around the bowl and it's surprised every time it sees this packet of cereal. And that happens over and over and again throughout the ad. And it's kind of amusing the first couple of times, but it's not so funny after that. And then, of course, we have one of my favorite characters. This is Dory from Finding Nemo. And of course, my kids think Dory is hilarious because it's obvious even to them that a fish could not possibly get by in the real world if it didn't have a decent capacity for learning and memory. So poor old Dory, she doesn't know who she is, where she's going, where she came from, or anything like that. So she obviously is going to struggle in life if she has no capacity for memory. Fortunately, the scientific reality is grossly different from public expectations in terms of the intelligence of fishes. And we've known that fish are pretty intelligent creatures for a very long time, at least the last 20 or 30 years. There's virtually no cognition tests that fish haven't completed in one way, shape, or form. And in fact, they've not only blitzed some of these tests, they've become the lead organisms for studying them. Here's a list of just some of the cool fishy cognition things that I've worked on over many years. And it's not just a random list. This is a list of behaviors that, most of them until recently we thought were unique to humans. So, fish are actually, contrary to what popular belief, fish are actually really good at learning and memory. They have these fantastic innovation skills. They can learn from one another. This is social learning. And that information can pass from one generation to another, which leads to the development of cooperation and culture, reconciliation even, and nest building, which may not sound that interesting, but that manipulation of the environment ultimately is probably a precursor to things like tool use. So I'm going to touch base briefly on each of these things without going into too much detail. I guess probably the best place to start is to think about learning and memory and bust that myth that goldfish have a 3-second memory, which most people will have heard. And this is one of the first experiments that I did when I moved to Macquarie. I didn't have any money at the time because I literally just got off the plane, but I took the flashing light off the back of my bicycle and stuck it to the side of the fish tank and then put a tube in there. And then every time the light came on, I basically fed the fish. And I just wanted to know how quickly that these fish would learn that association, this random flashing light and the arrival of food, which is, I guess, something like Pavlov's dogs. And here we can see that we have a bunch of different populations. The green one is a wild population. This is a crimson spotted rainbow fish. It's a native along the Australian coastline here. And you can see that they learn that really, really quickly. And there's even a morning and afternoon effect, which basically means they're not too impressed by me testing them again a second time during the day. But the other thing you can see quite clearly from these results is these captive reared populations, even if it's the same species in one case, they actually take much, much longer to learn. And this is a real indication that captive rearing of fishes can have significant implications on their cognition. And it also affects their brain size as well. So two things to get from this is that fish learn really, really quickly. And there's obviously an effective captive environment. So, environmental enrichment has become a real thing in fish behavior. So that's learning. How about memory? Well, this is an experiment I did when I was doing my honours project many years ago. And basically what I did is I taught these fishes to find an escape route in a mock trawl. I basically created a trawler that you would see behind a fishing boat, and there was an escape route in that. And as the trawl moved down the tank, the fish just had to find that escape route. And you can see they do that really quickly. It took them just 4 trials to figure that out. But perhaps more interestingly, I set those fish aside for a year, tested them again, and you can see they could carried on as if I did 10 trials in a row. So they had this incredible capacity to learn this completely artificial thing again and retain that information for a good period of time. And I was actually using an endangered freshwater fish that I was working on at the time. And these fish live maybe 2 or 3 years at most in the wild. And to learn something random like this and retain it for that length of time was pretty remarkable. Slightly more complicated things is time-place learning. And pretty much anybody who's listening could do this in their fish tank at home. It's pretty straightforward. All you need to do is teach the fish to expect to be fed at one end of the aquarium in the morning and the other end of the aquarium in the afternoon. Now, anybody who's kept fish will know that they sit there in expectation of being fed in the same place every morning, because like us, they're creatures of habit, and we do tend to feed our fish in the same place. But if you vary it a little bit, you find, and you can see the test condition here where we fed them once in the morning in one location and once in the afternoon in the other location. By 10, 12, 13 trials, they'd totally figured that out. This is random along here, this red line here. Random expectation is just feeding them at random times in random places. There's nothing to learn. Occasionally they do above expectation, but that's just a freak occurrence. It happens from time to time. So time-place learning is quite a cool thing. And in fact, we've got some really good evidence of this happening in the wild, where big stingrays come in waiting to be fed when fishermen are cleaning their catch at the end of the day. So time-place learning is pretty cool. It's only ever been done 2 times in 2 locations in fishes, but it's been done 4 times in 4 locations in birds. And I've never tried to emulate that, but it's something that is on my bucket list. Of course, fish are renowned for schooling. They do some amazing displays. And when you look at these schools, well, there's a couple of questions that enter my mind immediately. And that is, do they recognize one another? It seems like I can't tell them apart, but it seems that they can. And of course, the question that arises from that is, do they actually learn from one another? From a cognitive perspective, that's quite interesting. And that's called social learning. Here's an example of individual learning in guppies, the humble guppy. And this is quite a simple experiment. You take a bunch of stranger guppies and you develop these little schools. So you put them together for the first time in aquaria, and then you ask them at various different lengths of time, would you prefer to hang out with a stranger, or do you prefer to hang out with those familiar individuals within your group, within your social group? You can see it's a bit mixed up to start with. By about 8 to 12 days, they start to differentiate between their preferences. They start to prefer the familiar individuals within their groups, and they maintain that from that time on. Interestingly, when you test them after 12 days of isolation, so you separate them back out into individual tanks, and then you ask them, well, do you like your previous schoolmates, or do you like random strangers? Well, it turns out that they overwhelmingly still, after 12 days of isolation, prefer their familiar individuals from their old school. And in fact, another PhD came back and revisited this and tested them 5 weeks after isolation, and they still remembered the identity of their previous soulmates and preferred to hang out with them, which is, I think, pretty remarkable. Of course, the cool thing about social learning in general is that you can pass on information, not just between individuals of the same generation, but between generations. And that means that information that one individual learns can be passed on to other schoolmates, but it can also transcend generations and form the development of culture and cultural traditions. Now, we often think about culture from a human perspective, but actually there's a huge amount of work done on animal cultures, even in the context of conservation biology. This is a really nice example. When I was at the University of Cambridge, we started messing around with hatchery-reared salmon. Here's some little baby salmon here. They've been reared in hatcheries. The trouble with hatchery-reared salmon is they're completely naive. They don't know what real food looks like. They don't know what predators look like, but you can teach them. And here is a pre-trained individual that has been trained to attack this little worm when you put it in there. Now, you would think that fish do that automatically, but in fact, a hatchery-reared fish, when it sees live food for the first time, it actually backs away in fear, which is not the sort of response you're looking for when you ultimately want to release them in the wild. So here they attack that in a matter of seconds, which is pretty much what a wild fish would do. Now, what happens when you put a naive fish on the other side of a clear partition and you allow them to watch this trained demonstrator basically performing this behavior? And you can see that they learn that really, really rapidly. That's this pink line here. In just 6 exposures, they were indistinguishable from those pre-trained demonstrators. Some other interesting lines on this graph as well. This is a single naive individual, so it's sitting in that box by itself, trying to figure it out for itself. And that takes 12, 13, 14 trials or more, depending on the individual. Here's another interesting line, though. What happens if you put 2 naive individuals together side by side? In fact, what happens in that case is instead of getting positive feedback, you get negative feedback. So one fish looks at the other, that's going, oh, well, you're not eating that, or I'm not going to eat that. And there's this negative interaction, this negative social feedback that prevents them from eating. And that it takes a pair of naive individuals way longer than you might expect them to eventually attack this food. There's a really cool experiment that Mike Webster from University of St Andrews did a few years back. In our previous example, we had demonstrators that had just one source of knowledge, that is, something about prey items. In this example, what Mike and his colleagues did was they trained some individual sticklebacks to approach a light and another bunch of sticklebacks to approach and enter a little box feeder. And the task they ultimately had to solve was both approach the light and enter a little feeder box in order to get a food reward. Now, what's interesting is obviously untrained individuals really have no clue what's going on. If you only have demonstrators that know 1/2 of that information, they still don't really solve it. But when you have individuals that know both aspects of that task, they combine their information and everybody learns. So that's a really cool example of multiple demonstrators having multiple sources of information and combining it, and other individuals learning from the combination of knowledge that those demonstrators have, which is pretty cool. Here's a really artificial experiment that we did looking at the development of culture in guppies again. This is a pretty classic sort of situation where the fish are trained to find a food reward either by entering a red door or by entering a green door. It's completely artificial. There's no divide on the other side. The food reward is quite happily accessible from both doors. But we've trained a bunch of demonstrators to use a red door or a green door, and we pair them with demonstrators. And you can see on the first day, there's half demonstrators and half observers. And as each day goes by, we replace one of those demonstrators with a naive individual. And this is called a transmission train. And you can see why, because by the time we get to day 5, all the original trained individuals are gone, and there's only these naive individuals left. But you can still see that they've retained the preference for either the red door or the green door. So this is a really nice example of how cultural information passes from individual to individual. You can imagine this happening in the wild where, say, the matriarch in an elephant herd dies and passes the information to the next one and so on. Same sort of thing is happening in fishes. So it's quite easy to set up these sort of artificial social learning cultural systems in the lab, but it's also quite widespread in the wild. Here's a nice example. These are some really cool fishes, French grunts that hang out in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the Red Sea. And during the daytime, they actually hide amongst these urchins. And at nighttime, they venture out on very specific routes to their preferred foraging grounds. And Helfman and Schultz have been watching these fishes for quite some time. And they realized that as new individuals came to the group, they seemed to follow the rest of the individuals out along these very particular pathways. And something you'd never get permission to do this these days, but they actually translocated entire populations of these things. And in some cases, they left some of the residents in place. And in other cases, the residents were completely removed. And when the residents were left in place, well, the transplanted populations followed those residents out and back. So they'd learnt that route culturally. If you take the residents away completely, well, the newly transplanted individuals go off on these random walks into space. And of course, they don't find food, nor do they find the shelter at the end of the day. So there's some really nice examples of cultural learning in fishes, and it's nearly always in the context of migration routes, whether that be for foraging or breeding or overwintering. And we now think that this is actually really widespread in a whole bunch of different fish species, including a whole bunch of commercially important fish species. Fish also use tools. I won't talk about nest building because I think it'd be fair to say that about half the species of fishes on the planet build nests in some way, shape or form. But tool use is a really interesting one. And this is probably the best known example. This is an archerfish. They're native to Northern Australia, and everybody would have heard archerfish using water as a tool to squirt at terrestrial insects above the surface of the water. And of course, they have to learn how to do this as juveniles. But their skills are nothing short of remarkable. And this is a paper we published not so long ago, where basically these tusk fish are going out across the reef, grabbing these huge bivalves, sometimes urchins, and they bring them back to these very specific locations, and they basically bash the daylights out of these things in order to access the food inside. There's always one or two hanger-oners around the outside as well, and you can see these middens of shells around these preferred anvil sites. So tool use now, we know, occurs in about 12 species of tusk fish all over the world. So shortly after we published this, I had phone calls and emails from people in California and the Red Sea and all sorts of places saying, oh my God, we've seen the same thing. And suddenly we had all these videos and various other things sent to us, which was really cool. So tool use in this particular species, it seems to be mostly confined to wrasses at the moment, but bearing in mind there's more species of wrasse than there are virtually all mammals, so they're a very successful group. So I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that there is this big gap between the scientific reality of fish intelligence and the public expectation, and that's really important, not least because public opinion drives animal welfare legislation, right? It's the public that makes the government do important things that we want them to do. So intelligence, sentience, and ethics are really tied together. And I think it's important to remember that people are far more likely to show empathy towards animals that are smart. Fish are never going to win the cute and furry competition, but they could potentially, I think, impress people with some of the cool things that they're capable of doing. And importantly, intelligent animals have a greater capacity to suffer. So fortunately, those things do seem to tie together. When we're talking about fish, well, how many animals are we talking about? Well, it's very difficult to get a handle on how many companion animals there are in the world. I was recently at a conference specifically about fish, ornamental fish, aquaculture, and even they don't really know how many animals there are. And the only way they can figure it out is by looking at freight manifests as fish are shipped around the world. It varies somewhere between 1.5 billion fishes and about 15 billion. And that's a huge amount of error, I know, but it's a lot of fish in aquariums around the world. In research, it's well over 5 million now. It's growing annually all the time. Aquaculture, more than 100 billion individuals. Wreck fishing, well, it's about 1 million tons. And if you do a back of the envelope kind of calculation, that's about 10 billion individuals caught by wreck fishing. And commercial fishing, Fish Count have done calculations, and they reckon conservatively between 1 and 3 trillion individual fish captured and eaten by humans every year. And I should mention that aquaculture is rapidly replacing that too. So how does that compare? Remember, we're talking about trillions of individual fish. If you look at land-based food production systems, 57 billion birds, 3 billion animals. So collectively about 60 billion. So, there's about 1,000 times, at least 1,000 times more individual fish we're dealing with, even just in terms of food production systems. So the irony is, of course, that there was a very big push in the 60s and 70s, particularly out of UK and Europe, to protect the welfare of animals. And initially it was sort of companion animals and farm animals, but eventually, of course, it spread to all animals. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, fish seem to fall off the radar, and they have done for quite some time until fairly recently. It's really, I would say, in the last 10 years that the world has started to turn its attention to fish welfare. So one of the hot topics in fish welfare world, of course, is whether or not they feel pain. I think it would be fair to say that this discussion has been going on for more than 60 years. And my simple answer to this is yes. I mean, the reason you and I feel pain in the way that we do is because we inherited all of that mechanisms from our fishy ancestors. And if you think about nociceptors, which are the nerves that are actually detecting noxious stimuli, they date back to the annelids. So even little sandworms have the capacity to detect noxious stimuli. And of course, it's not a debate any longer about whether or not nociceptors exist in fishes. Lynn put that to bed in the early 2000s when we were in Edinburgh. And it's now really about whether or not they engage cognitively and emotionally with that pain. And that's where this question of cognition and sentience comes together. Of course, since the 60s, there's been this, what I call the Anti-Fish Pain League. There's a few scientists around the world who are basically protecting the I guess, rights of recreational fishermen and the associated industries, you know, like big tobacco, like the coal and oil industry. There's a lot of money invested in this. And if you think of even just commercial fisheries alone, it's billions of dollars that we're talking about, let alone recreational fishing. And of course, their argument right from the early 60s has been that, well, humans, arguably, maybe, use their cortex to process pain. That is, the cortex is in some way involved in human sentience. And therefore, if any animal lacks a human cortex, they're incapable of feeling pain, which, of course, by their definition would be basically nothing but a couple of mammals would be capable of feeling pain. Of course, the trouble with that argument is, apart from the fact that it's ridiculously egocentric, is that it totally ignores the evolutionary history of the vertebrate brain and is completely born of an ignorance of fish brain anatomy and function. And don't even get me started on the concept of convergent evolution. So just to illustrate how silly this idea is, this structure, what I call the structure function fallacy, we can take this to a sort of analogy in the context of vision. And we know for certain that humans use their visual cortex for analyzing visual information. And I don't think anybody would agree that if animals lack a visual cortex, a human visual cortex, they're incapable of seeing. It's exactly the same argument, just a slightly different sense that we're talking about. And of course, we know that fishes use part of their forebrain, their optic lobes and their cerebellum to process visual information. They don't have a visual cortex. They use different parts of their brain to analyze that information. And the same, of course, is true of pain. So in short, our brain is not all that different from a fish. And again, we should remember that our brains actually came from fishy ancestors. And the only thing that's slightly different is the manner in which the forebrain develops and grows during ontogeny. So the function is much the same. So rather than concentrating, which I think a lot of people do, don't concentrate on what the human brain does. Think about what is the point of feeling pain in the first place. And of course, you have to wonder what the evolutionary significance of pain is, what's its function. And it's pretty obvious. And that is that its job fundamentally is to keep animals safe from harm, right? And so it should not be surprising that the pain perception and the associated emotional response are a highly conserved evolutionary trait. For me, there's kind of two components to it. There's the initial reflex component. Anybody who's touched a hot plate will know your hand withdraws, and that is a completely automated response. Okay, that's just a reflex. And there'll be those who argue that everything a fish does is just reflexive. That's kind of a pretty standard argument that you often hear. But there's a second part, and that is this sort of long-term, I guess, consolidation of that information. And that is that you remember that object X or context Y is dangerous and you should stay away from that in future. And this is where complex cognition and emotions are really important. I would argue that there's really no sense in detecting painful stimuli if you then don't remember to avoid them in the future, because you would get burnt and literally turn around and walk straight back into the fire. You have to be cognitively engaged and emotionally engaged for the system to work. Okay, so the emotional response to painful stimuli is a really strong negative reinforcer that ensures that you learn from that experience. So fundamentally, that's what emotions are for. They're about reinforcing positive things and making sure you don't do the negative things again. They're reinforcers for your learning and memory. And so this is why illustrating the cognitive capacity of animals is really important from a welfare perspective. As I've mentioned, intelligent animals are more likely to suffer from poor welfare because they can remember and anticipate painful events that have happened to them in the past, and they can project that if they find themselves in a similar context, it may well happen again. Here's a nice example of why we think pain is important globally. This is kind of the evolutionary significance of pain. You can see it everywhere in nature, and it's really common in the marine environment. There's some classic examples here. For those of you in Europe, you've all gone out and collect sticklebacks and put them in a jar as a kid. And you will have noticed that some populations have these really big spines and armor plating. And those spines are specifically there to protect them from predators. A pike or something will bite down on those things and get a spike through the roof of its mouth. And there's some fantastic videos of pike trying to eject sticklebacks from their mouths as fast as they possibly can, having had that painful experience. It doesn't just happen in fishes, though. Here's some nice examples in Daphnia. So when Daphnia are aware that fish predators are in the environment and they can smell them, their developmental trajectory changes to have these big spikes and cones on their heads. And that's doing exactly the same thing that these spikes on the sticklebacks are doing. It's to hurt their predators. And the predators will know in future that these things aren't good to eat, right? So they learn from that experience. Here's some jellyfish. Of course, jellyfish have stinging cells on these nice trailing arms here. And of course, those stinging cells are not just used for catching fishes, they're also used for protection, as anybody who's been stung by a jellyfish will tell you. And of course, little Nemo here is actually making the most of these stinging cells. This is an anemone, and actually Nemo and his mates actually have a really thick mucus layer that protects them from the stinging cells, right? So that's why they're able to hide amongst these things. The predators can't get at them because they don't want to be stung. It hurts. So they stay away, and Nemo is safe in his little house. Of course, one of the problems with emotions is that it's a very private experience, right? And so when you go to a hospital, for example, and I've done this countless times because I always fall off my bike and hurt myself. The first things the doctors say is, how much does it hurt? Literally on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does it hurt? That is how we currently measure pain in humans. It's a verbal response, right? And of course, kids who have had very little experience and animals who can't speak are incapable of telling you in any kind of reasonable way how they're feeling. And so what we do is we rely on these signs and symptoms. Okay, so anybody who's had kids will know this. If you've had pets, the same thing, right? There are a bunch of signs and symptoms. If you've done first aid, basic first aid, you look for the signs and symptoms of pain, right? So you can use these behavioral signs and symptoms as an indirect measure of estimating whether an animal is suffering or not. Okay, so some of those might be, the kid or the animal might be socially withdrawn, or they go off their food, they become aggressive, their breathing rate goes up, they're less active, or maybe they're nursing or protecting an injured area, or so on and so forth. They can be conflicted and confused and all sorts of things, unable to concentrate. So there's a huge number of ways that we can determine just by looking at the behavior of a child or an animal that it's suffering from pain. And this goes to the other brain problem. Of course, we have no way of knowing what another person is thinking or feeling, let alone what another animal is thinking or feeling. So we rely on these outward expressions of behavior to judge, and facial expressions in humans is a real classic. Here's a table of the sorts of signs and symptoms that you might look for in animals when you're trying to figure out whether they're capable of feeling pain. There's a whole bunch of different criteria down here. Some of them are associated with nociceptors, some of them are a bit physiological. And as you move further and further down this list, though, you'll find that they become increasingly complex in terms of the cognitive engagement that's required and the complexity of that behavior. The main thing I want to get out of this is that there's a whole bunch of behaviors down here that are clearly not reflexive, and they're clearly not just nociception. There's some complex emotions and learning and memory going on down here. The other thing is that you have a look across this table. Green means that we have evidence of these things. Obviously, in mammals, we know a lot because we've been working on rats and mice and humans for ages, but fishes are easily the next best studied organism. And shortly after that, oddly enough, it's decapod crustaceans, then birds, and then cephalopods. So do not be surprised if you find that decapod crustaceans and cephalopods start showing up in animal welfare legislation in Europe and elsewhere around the world. In fact, it's already starting to happen. I just want to go through some of the examples just quickly. This is a trout that's been treated with either an injection of saline or venom or a mild acetic acid solution. And you can see that it changes the time that it resumes feeding if it's suffering some sort of pain. So it goes off its food, it takes quite some time to come back. The control situation is just a handled fish. Here's in a slightly different version of the same thing. You get a reduction in activity when they're suffering from pain. But if you use a local anesthetic, then their behavior basically returns to normal. This is a change in opercular beat rate. Unsurprisingly, breathing rate goes up when they're suffering from pain. You can see that in acetic acid here. Apply some lidocaine, local anesthetic, their breathing comes back down. So there's some pretty straightforward examples of how behavior change in a simple way. But how about something a little bit more complicated? And I love these experiments. And notice how long ago these are a long time ago these experiments were done. Effectively, what you do is you put this trout in here, and at the other end of this, you can have a clear partition, and you can put some friends or some food or whatever it is you like here. And you look at what the behavior of the fish does when a shock is present and when it's not. And what you're basically asking this fish to do is to make a decision. How much pain is it willing to put up with in order to access something that it really wants? Does it really want access to its friends? How much is it willing to put up with in order to get access to them? How hungry does the fish have to be to take that shock in order to get access to food? Well, in the case of food, if you starve a fish for 3 days, eventually they get so hungry that they're willing to get shocked in order to get access to food. So you can start to titrate the sorts of things that animals are willing to pay or trade off in order to get access to other things that they're willing to get. And this sort of titration approach to animal behavior is really common in welfare now. This experiment where they have their access to friends, I think is really compelling, and it's a bit of a horrendogram. But the only thing I want you to notice is that this is the far side of the aquarium, right? Away from the shock. Before the shock is initiated, well, it's about 30%, which is what you'd expect by random. But of course, after the shock and during the shock, they avoid the shock as much as possible. So they move away from that shock and spend as much time in the far end of the aquarium. On the other hand, when their mates are on the other side, look, this is the shock side. And how much time do they spend close to their mates? Well, of course, when there's no shock, they like to be close to their mates. That's not surprising, fish school. When they're shocked, it doesn't change. But what's interesting is afterwards, it may even go up further. And the reason for that is when fish are stressed or frightened, their need to be with other fishes, their compulsion to school is so strong that they're willing to put up with repeated shocks in order to stay with their schoolmates, which I think tells you something really important about how highly fish value access to their friends. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is emotions. And of course, in the expression of emotions in man and animals, Charles Darwin was really cool when he pointed out that the emotions we see in humans have precursors in animals. And he wrote some really amazing work. If you haven't had time, go back and read this book. He basically pointed out that emotions are adaptive, that they basically serve to motivate behavior, but they also act as a mode of communication, a mode of expressing your inward feelings to other individuals. So it's a way to express your inner state effectively. Of course, we know that humans have a whole bunch of emotions. They're quite subjective experiences. And again, we quite often rely on verbal reporting of this in the same way that we do of pain. But of course, there are signs and symptoms of various these things as well. So if you look at people's facial expressions, for example, you can often tell whether people are angry or whatever. Of course, I guess the most fundamental level, emotions guide animal behavior by motivating rewarding behavior and dissuading behavior that results in punishment. So objects and contexts around the world will invariably vary in their emotional salience and valence, but that can also change with experience as an animal moves around the world. And from a neurophysiological perspective, fishes actually possess functional equivalents of the limbic and dopaminergic nervous systems, which is linked to emotion and emotion learning. And they have particular parts in the brain which we know are specifically there for dealing with emotional learning and memory. So one of the cool things that's emerging in, terrestrial-based systems at the moment is this notion of cognitive bias, that is examining how our emotions change the way we perceive and interact with the world. And the classic example here is the sort of pessimist. A pessimist will look at half a glass of water and say, oh, it's half empty. While an optimist will say, yeah, half a glass of water. That's sweet, just what I was looking for. So, your perception of the world changes depending on your inner states. And so actually you could be pessimistic or optimistic depending on your life experience and whether or not you're being experienced positive or negative welfare. And this kind of cognitive bias is starting to be increasingly used in terrestrial systems to get at emotions and welfare. It hasn't been done in fishes, but it could be quite easily. And this is the kind of classic paradigm. You train a bunch of animals to approach a positive reinforcer, train them to avoid a negative reinforcer, and then you give them this option. There's an ambiguous signal. An optimist will approach that expecting to be rewarded. A pessimist will avoid it, thinking that it might well be a dangerous context and to be avoided at all costs. So you can actually do pretty straightforward learning and memory experiments to get at the cognitive bias, the emotions, and therefore assess welfare in terrestrial animals. And I think it could be done in fish. We've only just started to really work on this. It hasn't been done in any great detail yet. So I think our growing understanding of fish cognition and neurophysiology means that moving forward, we can not only prevent negative welfare, which has been very much the concentration that people have looked at recently, and we can start to actively encourage positive welfare. We can do that in terrestrial systems. We can certainly do that in aquatic systems as well. And I think there's increasingly a call for adopting welfare standards, particularly in aquaculture. Of course, the difficulty is that we're dealing with about 36,000 species of fishes, and each of them are unique. So there won't be a single solution to everything, but there may well be common themes. So I think it's a daunting task, but I think it's one that we will have to embark on. So there's a bit of a conclusion. Fish are intelligent, despite what most people think. The evolutionary function of pain is ancient and highly conserved amongst vertebrates and probably some invertebrates as well. Fish have the neurons for nociception. They experience positive and negative emotions. They even have parts of the brain that are specifically dealing with those emotions, emotion learning. They engage cognitively and emotionally with pain perception. Fish pain is just as good as it is in mammals in terms of the evidence and the sorts of experiments that have been done. We can use cognitive bias to investigate welfare, which is kind of a cool twist on cognition experiments. And we should be increasingly encouraging positive welfare. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I could listen to you for days on end. Absolutely fascinating research. You're a phenomenal storyteller, so that really, really drew me in. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm very curious. And we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, for the question and answer period. But has there been a specific bit of research in all of your years of conducting these studies that has stopped you in your tracks and sort of taught you something that you absolutely didn't expect going into the studies?
Yes, well, I mean, this is actually a study that I didn't do personally, but I've been looking at individual recognition in fishes for quite some time, particularly in the context of familiarity. But recently, because archerfish are increasingly used because of their amazing skills at using water as a tool, people are starting to use them to look at cognition more broadly. And there was a really cool paper that came out recently that showed that archerfish can recognize individual human faces, which I think is kind of like mind-blowing to start with. But then they trained them to recognize human faces front on. And they found that even if they rotated them through 90 degrees so that they could see them side on, the fish could still differentiate between human and faces, which is, I mean, that's just astonishing. So their capacity for that sort of complex recognition of objects, whether it be faces or anything for that matter, is, second to none. So I guess it shouldn't be surprising that they can tell each other apart, and we haven't the faintest idea.
That's amazing. And I was thinking as you were speaking, I know what book is going on my Christmas wish list because I want to learn a lot more about everything that you were talking about. And that was not a planted plug. We may just have time for one or two more questions. This one follows on what you just touched on, but it's very specific to tilapia. So you may or may not be familiar with this research, but the question is, how does social hierarchy influence social learning in species such as tilapia?
Yeah, well, it makes a really big difference. So when we first started working on social learning in any kind of learning for that matter, in Atlantic salmon, the juveniles are extremely territorial and there's a massive hierarchy there. And we tried to teach them all sorts of things. And the only fish that ever showed any kind of behavior was the head honcho, the highest ranked fish. But interestingly, if you took that individual out, the next rank up would move into that position and start displaying the behavior, even though they'd never showed it until you took out that dominant individual. So it has a really big influence because often that dominant fish can totally monopolize and suppress the behavior of every other individual. But we also know that dominance can influence who learns from who, and how information is transferred as well. So, of course, subordinates pay a lot of attention to the dominant fish. And if you can teach a dominant fish to do something, then although the subordinates don't display that behavior, ultimately, when you test them by themselves, they do. But, sometimes it can take a week or more for the fish to recover from that hierarchy before they start displaying the behavior.
That's amazing. Perhaps one last question, and then sadly we're going to have to wrap it up for today. But what is your impression of the level of consumer awareness around this issue at all? And then I'll just maybe expand on that question. What can be done to increase consumer awareness beyond additional Disney movies?
Yeah, well, I like additional Disney movies, so you can bring that on. That's all good. Keep my kids entertained. But look, I think the awareness is growing, and it's particularly in the last, I would say, 5-6 years that NGOs and various other welfare groups have started to put this on their agenda. And I've been working with NGOs both here and elsewhere in the world, and they are starting to have campaigns specifically about fish welfare. Up until a couple of years ago, it just didn't exist. Increasingly, though, if you look at aquaculture, because aquaculture is growing massively everywhere around the world. In Southeast Asia, it's huge, but it's also growing rapidly in Europe and elsewhere. In Europe, I already work with a bunch of companies. In fact, I've got another meeting shortly after this, where we're developing welfare codes of practice for aquaculture. And the reason we can do that is because the public in particular, are increasingly aware of where their food is coming from, and they're increasingly concerned about animal welfare. And I think some of the concern to terrestrial welfare and thinking about where their meat comes from in terms of whether it be beef or whatever else, it's starting to transfer across to fish products. When I was in the UK, living in the UK 10, 15 years ago, even vegetarians ate fish. That was kind of the thing, which is kind of mind-blowing in a way. They're not potatoes, they're animals. And that has actually started to change. So people's perspective is changing, and I think it's changing pretty rapidly. It's happening faster in Europe than elsewhere, but I think it will catch on. In terms of how we promote that, well, I think by going out there and giving as many talks as I can, I'm only putting a minor dent, but as more and more people become aware of this, I think it will eventually snowball, and it'll become commonplace to think of fish as animals and not a cereal or whatever it may be. So that's going to be important moving forward.
Thank you. That's going to stick with me. Fish are not cereal. So maybe we'll wrap it up on that note for the day. I want to be respectful of everyone's schedules. Thank you so much again, Dr. Brown, for joining us today, for sharing your research and inspiring us to learn much more about all aquatic species and their incredible abilities. Thank you to all of our audience members for sticking with us throughout this first day of the Aquatic Life Conference. We have 3 more days full, chock-a-block full of more of these incredible sessions, some workshops and networking events. So please keep your eye out for post-conference communications that'll inform you for ways that you can continue to be involved in the protection of aquatic animals. Tomorrow's entire focus will be on campaigning and policy. So many sessions dedicated to campaigning and policy. Beyond that, please follow us on social media, visit us on ali.fish for more information, and then please continue these discussions as well as your networking through that app that's available to everyone, the Whova app. And beyond that, we wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are in the world. And we hope to see you all again tomorrow. Thank you so much. Take care.